So I just started putting together an Infinity F5J to fly, and so far I have the servo tray installed, just one of the trays that came with the model. I epoxied it in, and I put some carbon toe at the joint also over the epoxy just to add some extra strength. And I also have a CNC motor mount that I installed. In my intro video, I said that the nose was 30 millimeters, but as it comes cut, it's actually 32. So this is a 32 millimeter mount, and it fit right in. It was a little loose, but I wrapped the shoulder portion with a couple of strands of Kevlar rope to tighten it up, and just put a little bit of thickened epoxy on that, and pushed the mount in, and it went in no problem. I have a few tips for the tail, for putting the tail together. Let me see if I can show you guys. See, let's see if this focuses. The elevator horn here, when the elevator's mounted, this is loose, so it moves around a little bit. There's some foam in the fuselage, and when you push down on the tail, the horn hits the foam. So if you want to try to get more down throw, I would suggest sanding that foam out of there a little bit, which I'm going to do. So I'll do that and show you guys how it goes. Okay, I did some sanding on this foam block in the tail here. You can see there's a hard point in there for the pin that the aluminum rod that comes out of the rudder that slots into the fuselage. The hard point is in there for that. So you can't sand a whole bunch, but I did sand into that hard point a little bit. There seems to be plenty of epoxy there. And I just used this dowel with some sandpaper on it and just went in there and sanded this down. And I also sanded flat a little bit to allow some room for the pushrod to come down a little further when you pull full deflection. So let's put it together and see how much down throw we can get now. So I have the tail on here temporarily, and let's see how much more down throw we can get. Let's see, this seems to be about full down deflection, which is quite a bit. I could probably get a little more if I needed to sand. I could sand a little bit more out of it, but I got quite a bit more than how it came, so I'm pretty happy with this. I think I'll leave it like this and just build the model and see how it flies, and if I need more I can always go back in there and sand out a little bit more. So we'll continue with the build, and if I have any more tips I'll let you guys know. So when assembling the tail on the fuselage, it can be pretty tight. Initially when you get the model, the pieces fit together really tight. So I'm going to do a few things to try to make the assembly a little easier, so it's not a pain in the ass when you're trying to put the model together at the field. So I noticed this is the pin that holds the elevator to the fuselage, and it goes in the stab like this and pushes in. This fits pretty good if I can get it to focus. It's a little tight towards the end, so I don't think I'm going to do too much to that. I might see if I can get this to focus. I might put a little chamfer on that first step there just so it goes in initially a little easier. So I think I'll do that. The pin in the vertical goes through the elevator pretty easily, but in the fuselage it's a little tight. So I think what I'm going to do with that also is put a chamfer on the end of that aluminum rod, and I think I will just a little bit sand this hole just to try to get it to fit together a little easier. The other thing too is there's a mold line on this pylon, and it does have a little ridge, so I think I'm going to file this down a little bit just to get the surface nice and smooth. So I'll do those things and then we'll see how the tail goes together. Okay, I have my parts fitting together pretty nicely. I did sand the seam down slightly just with some 200 grit sandpaper. In here, this hole is actually like an aluminum sleeve, so you can't do a whole lot of sanding in there, but I did just roll up some 220 grit sandpaper and I just twisted it in here a little bit just to clean up some of the burrs. And then what I did was I took this kind of grinding bit for my Dremel, and I just by hand just put it right here and twirled it at the top of the hole just to get a little bit of a bevel on the carbon part instead of a real sharp crisp edge. And then on the rudder, hopefully this will focus on here, I did put a bevel on this edge, a little bit with a file, then I went over it with some sandpaper to smooth it out. And these fit together really easily now. I don't know if I can show you this with one hand. Let me try here. There we go. So that should be a lot better than how it was when I got it. And what else did I do? I also put a very slight bevel on that first step here. Right there, focus, yeah. And I did a little bit of sanding on that too, just to help it get in the elevator a little easier. So I think it should all go together pretty good. And I'm going to do one more fit and make sure everything goes together the way I want. And if I have to do a few more tweaks and tuning on it, then I'll let you guys know. Okay, all my mods and fine tuning and sanding seem to work pretty good. Tail's on nice and flush. It was easy to get together and assemble. So I think those few little steps are really going to help out getting the model assembled together quickly when you get to the field. Alright, I have my weird glowing rudder here, and a few more tips, or maybe not tips, but just things that I'm doing slightly differently than probably the manufacturer recommends. Putting the control horn in for the rudder here, and the way he calls for it is to cut a slot on this side of the rudder, so it would be a long slot sunk in, and then you would you know, push the horn in like this, which is fine. That would work great. But I wanted it to look a little neater, so what I did was I took like 4 millimeters off the end of the horn here, and then I also sanded down maybe a millimeter off the bottom just to make this a little smaller. And then for the horn, sorry, we get this like weird neon orange glow happening. But for the horn, I just cut a slot here with an X-Acto knife and opened up a little bit here. And then I just used a file coming in this way to open up and remove the foam inside the rudder. You can see. And the way this is going to work is basically just slot the rudder in like so. And it pushes in. And then basically you align the hole in the rudder with the hinge line to make sure that your pivot point is, or your attachment point is directly on the hinge line. And then I'm just going to epoxy this in. So this is a little modification I made, just basically to make it look a little nicer so I wouldn't have to open up the fin all the way back to here for this horn. What else have I done? Got my, wow, this lighting is really weird tonight. Got my pushrod started on the fuselage. As you can see, the elevator side is much longer than the rudder control horn, and you really need a fairly long elevator horn to get the right throw out of the elevator. And with this side-by-side arrangement, I basically pushed the servos as far over as I could to this side, and I used a really small horn on this servo, and I used this MP Jet Z-bend for the rudder, because there's not going to be a whole lot of strain on the rudder since this is a F5J model, and the Z-bend is narrower than the clevis, so I can push the servo farther over without having the clevis rubbing up against the fuselage. And then on this side, you can see I have virtually no gap between the elevator clevis and the side of the fuselage. But what I did to get a little bit of clearance is I've actually, with a Dremel tool, just ground down this side of the clevis a little bit, maybe took 1.5 millimeters off of it, and actually put a slight bevel up here so the canopy would clear. And then on the bottom, if you can see, there's a like a half moon I ground out of the bottom side of the clevis, so that when I move the elevator, it allows me a little more throw, because that half moon kind of is a clearance for the hub of the servo arm. So I did that, and then the final thing I want to mention about the push rods is that there's basically no pushrod tubing from about here all the way to the servo. So this is just the stainless steel rod, and the pushrod sleeve ends about here. So what I've done is I just found a piece of tubing. This is some Teflon tubing, but you can use, you know, any kind really you have lying around that fits. And I cut a section maybe 25 or 30 millimeters and slid it over the elevator push rod before I glued the coupler and clevis on. And I'm going to do the same thing for the rudder. And let's see if I can get this. Yeah, you can see the section of tubing here. And what I'm going to do is, when everything's done, it'll probably be like one of the last things I do. I'll just push this down a little bit and glue that tubing to the side of the fuselage. So I'll have an anchor point here, basically midway between the servo and where the tubing ends in the fuselage, just to make sure nothing flexes under load. So yeah, that's about it. It's coming along pretty good. The plan is to put the battery back here. I'm going to use this 68 gram or 67 gram Red Fox baby motor, which I'm excited to use because on the bench it was showing me some good performance with some bench tests. So that'll go there. And we have plenty of room here for speed control and receiver and altimeter with the flight pack going back here. But if I do need to move the flight pack, maybe if I'm tail heavy or something, I will have enough room to put it here and maybe move the receiver back here. So this is going to give me a few options for my layout. But yeah, that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and glue this horn in and do a few little more things on the push rods. And then if I have any other tips or tricks or updates, I'll let you guys know. Thanks.